Thomas Wright was a man of the land. His ranch stretched for miles, the land rich with the cattle that he had raised with his own hands. But despite the wide open spaces and the freedom that came with owning so much land, Thomas had always felt a sense of loneliness that he couldn't shake. He was a man of few words, quiet in his ways, but anyone who met him could tell that there was a fire within him, a fire that had yet to find its true purpose. Born and raised in a small town near the ranch, Thomas had inherited everything from his father, who had taught him how to handle cattle and work the land. But his father had never prepared him for the kind of heartache that could come from seeing others suffer. While Thomas had everything a man could need, a home, a thriving business, and a piece of land that was the envy of many, there was something missing. His heart ached not for what he lacked, but for what others suffered, especially the women in his town. The town had always been rough, especially for women. With the hard times of the Wild West, families were struggling. But there was one problem that seemed to grow worse with each passing year. Women were being sold at auction. It wasn't that the men wanted to do it, it was necessity. The economy had taken a dive, and many families had fallen into debt. These women were often left with no other choice but to be sold like cattle at a market. It wasn't a question of their worth, but of survival. Thomas had seen it happen more times than he could count. Women, desperate and frightened, standing tall in front of the auction block, looking out at a crowd of men bidding on them. He had seen wives, mothers, and daughters, all with hopes and dreams like anyone else, being sold away. They were nothing but property to be bought, traded, and discarded. It broke Thomas's heart every time, but there was nothing he could do. He wasn't a man who could change the world, not with the money he had or the influence he could wield. He was just one man on a ranch with a quiet life. Still, every time he saw the auction block, Thomas felt the knot in his stomach tighten. His own heart ached with every woman he saw, knowing they were about to lose everything. He had grown up around many of these women. They weren't just strangers, they were daughters of friends, neighbors, and families he had known his whole life. Some were young and bright-eyed, while others were older, more seasoned by life, but all of them were in danger of being sold. The thought kept him up at night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, wondering how it had come to this. How had things gotten so bad for these women? And why was no one doing anything about it? He thought about his own life. He had plenty, but what good was it if he couldn't help them? One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with orange and purple hues, Thomas stood outside his house, looking over the ranch. The land stretched out before him, vast and empty. It was a beautiful sight, but it felt cold to him. He had all this land, all this success, but it meant nothing if people were suffering. The women who had been auctioned off, they haunted his thoughts. He had heard whispers around town. Some of the women had been sold to men far older than them, to strangers they would never see again. Their lives, their futures, taken away in an instant. It wasn't right. That evening, something in Thomas snapped. He knew he couldn't keep standing by, watching as the women in his town were sold like cattle. He couldn't sit back anymore. He had to do something, anything to help. But what could he do? He wasn't a rich man who could buy all of them and set them free. But maybe there was another way. His mind raced with thoughts and plans, each one crazier than the last. But there was one idea that stuck with him, one bold plan that refused to leave his mind. What if he could marry them? Not for love, but to save them from the auction block. In his town, marriage had a certain protection. It was a way for a man and woman to form a bond that couldn't be easily broken. The idea seemed impossible, yet it made perfect sense to him. He didn't know how, but Thomas had made up his mind. He would marry them, 10 women all in one day. At first, Thomas dismissed the idea as ridiculous. How could he marry 10 women? He didn't even know them all well. But the more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only solution. The idea came to him with such clarity that he knew he had to try. It wasn't about love. It wasn't even about what people would think. It was about saving them, giving them a chance at something better than being sold at an auction. But how could he convince them? How would he explain such an odd proposal to women who were already in a desperate situation? Some might think him mad. Others might laugh at him, but some might understand. He wasn't offering them love or a fairy tale life. He was offering them safety. Thomas spent the next few days thinking of a plan. He needed to talk to the women, to convince them that this was their best chance. He would have to be careful. These women were facing their worst fear, being sold away to strangers who would never care for them. They wouldn't want to be married just to be saved. He knew that, but what other choice did they have? What other hope did they have left? As the days passed, Thomas prepared himself for the impossible task ahead of him. He wasn't sure how it would work, but he knew that if he didn't try, nothing would ever change. The town was quiet, but Thomas's mind was racing. The auction was only a few days away, and Thomas had no time to waste. He had made his decision. He would save them, even if it meant taking a chance he'd never taken before. The auction day was quickly approaching, and Thomas Wright couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping through his fingers. His plan was bold, reckless even, but in his heart he knew it was the only way. He had already made up his mind. The women he had seen on the auction block before, those whose faces were filled with hopelessness, would not go through that fate again. They deserved more than that, and Thomas was willing to do whatever it took to give them a fighting chance. His first task was to find the women. They were scattered throughout the town, and while some of them were familiar to him, many were strangers, outsiders who had been sent here by unfortunate circumstances. Thomas knew he couldn't approach this like any other task. This would require careful consideration and patience. The women wouldn't easily agree to such an unusual proposal, and he had to be sure that what he was doing wasn't going to cause more harm than good. Thomas began by visiting the homes of some of the women he knew best. He started with Sarah, a young woman who had been raised in town but whose family had fallen on hard times. Her father, once a successful farmer, had lost everything, and now Sarah found herself with no choice but to accept whatever fate awaited her. When Thomas knocked on her door, she greeted him with a hesitant smile. She knew him well enough. They had exchanged pleasantries in town, but nothing more. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, and Thomas could see the sadness in her heart. "Sarah," Thomas said gently, stepping inside, "I need to talk to you about something important." She closed the door behind him, her curiosity piqued. "What's going on, Mr. Wright?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't sure how to begin, but there was no turning back now. "The auction is coming up," he said, watching her closely for any sign of fear or anger. "And I can't let you or any of the women be sold like cattle. It's wrong, and I can't stand by and do nothing." Sarah's face went pale. "I don't understand," she stammered. "What are you proposing?" Thomas paused for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I'm offering you a chance. I'm willing to marry you. All of you, every woman who is in danger of being sold. It's not about love, it's about survival. You won't be auctioned off if I marry you." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Marry me? But why? Why would you do something like that?" Thomas sighed. "I know it's a strange thing to ask, but I'm asking because I can't bear to see you all suffer. The only other choice is to let you be sold, and I won't let that happen. I can't sit back and watch it." For a long moment, Sarah was silent. Thomas could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't know him well enough to trust him, and the idea of marrying a man just to escape an auction block was something she couldn't easily accept. Yet what other choice did she have? Her family had nothing left, and the thought of being auctioned off to the highest bidder was terrifying. I don't know what to say," Sarah finally whispered, her voice trembling. "It's so unexpected. I've never heard of anything like this. But you're right. I don't want to be sold." Thomas nodded, understanding her fear. "I know it's not ideal, but I promise you I'll make sure you're safe. You'll be free from the auction block, and I'll do my best to protect you." Sarah hesitated, still unsure, but in the end she saw no other option. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I don't have a choice." Relief washed over Thomas, but he knew the hardest part was just beginning. He had to convince the others. He needed to talk to every woman who was at risk, and he had to do it quickly. Over the next few days, Thomas went from house to house, visiting the women who were set to be auctioned. Each time he faced the same skepticism, the same doubts. Some of the women rejected his offer outright. They didn't trust a man they barely knew, and they didn't want to be tied to anyone just to escape their fate. But Thomas didn't give up. He knew that if he could just reach the right people, if he could make them see that this was the only way out, he might stand a chance. One by one, the women began to listen. Some were more willing than others, but all were frightened. The auction block was a fate that no one wanted to face, and for most of them, Thomas's proposal was the only lifeline they had left. The next woman Thomas spoke to was Martha, an older woman who had lost her husband years ago. She was proud, strong, and independent, but her family had fallen into debt. She had spent years working hard to keep her head above water, but now it seemed that the land she had once loved so much was slipping through her fingers. When Thomas told her about his plan, she looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Marry me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "What kind of nonsense is that?" "I know it sounds strange," Thomas said, his voice steady, "but it's the only way. You'll be safe. No one will auction you off, not while I'm here." Martha was silent for a moment, thinking hard. She had seen so many women in her situation, and she knew that something needed to be done. "You're a fool if you think I'll fall for this," she said, shaking her head. "But you're right about one thing. We don't have a choice. If this is the only way to keep from being sold, then I'll agree. But I'm not doing it for you, Thomas. I'm doing it because I can't face being sold." Thomas smiled gently, relieved that she had agreed. "Thank you, Martha. You won't regret it." By the end of the week, Thomas had convinced several women to join him in his plan. Some were wary, others resigned, but all of them knew that this was the only way out of a fate they could not control. Now, with his plan taking shape, Thomas knew that the real challenge was ahead. The wedding. He would have to marry them all in one day, a task that seemed nearly impossible. But as he looked over the faces of the women who had agreed to join him, he felt a sense of purpose rise within him. He wasn't just saving them. He was giving them a chance at a future. The day of the auction was fast approaching, and Thomas could only hope that everything would fall into place. The morning of the mass wedding had arrived. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden hue over the ranch, as Thomas Wright paced nervously outside his modest home. His boots crunched on the gravel as he took slow, measured steps, trying to steady his breath. Today, he was going to do something that would change everything for these women, and for himself. It was hard to believe, but as the hours ticked by, he knew there was no turning back. He had spent the past few days making preparations, talking to the women who had agreed to the plan. Each of them had their own story, their own fears and doubts. Some had known Thomas for years, others just by reputation. But today, they were all about to become part of something much bigger than themselves. The plan had seemed impossible when it first came to him, but now it felt like the only thing that mattered. He had promised them safety, freedom from the auction block, and now he had to follow through. The women had agreed, but none of them had ever imagined themselves in a situation like this. The idea of being married in a group to a man they barely knew was foreign and strange. But, as each of them had come to realize, there was no other option. The auction would take place that afternoon, and Thomas's proposal was their only way out. For Thomas, the day started early. He made his way to the church where the ceremony was to take place. It was a small chapel at the edge of town, worn and weathered by years of use. As he stood in front of the church, he could see the women arriving in their modest dresses, looking nervous, anxious, and unsure of what to expect. They had trusted him with their lives, and now it was time to hold up his end of the bargain. Sarah, the first woman he had spoken to, was already waiting near the door. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she had a faraway look in her eyes as if she was trying to make sense of what was happening. Thomas approached her, offering a reassuring smile, but she barely returned it. Instead, she nodded stiffly as he took her hand. "It's going to be all right, Sarah," he said gently, trying to calm her nerves. "We're doing the right thing. You won't regret this." She glanced up at him, her voice soft and uncertain. "I hope you're right, Mr. Wright, I really do." The other women were beginning to gather in the small chapel, each of them looking just as hesitant as Sarah. Thomas could feel his own nerves bubbling up inside him, but he refused to show it. He had promised them all a chance at freedom, and now it was time to make good on that promise. He couldn't back out now. One by one, the women walked down the aisle, their steps slow and deliberate. They didn't smile. They didn't speak to each other. Each woman was lost in her own thoughts, trying to make sense of the situation. It was as if they had all been brought together in this strange, almost surreal moment, with no real understanding of what the future would hold. Martha, the oldest of the group, was the last to walk down the aisle. She moved with a quiet dignity, her face set in a serious expression. There was no hesitation in her steps. She had made her choice, and now she was going to face whatever came next. When she reached the altar, she stood beside Thomas, looking him in the eye with a mixture of respect and defiance. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice low but strong. "This isn't something I take lightly, Thomas. You're offering us something big, but I need to know you're ready to follow through. Thomas met her gaze, his expression firm. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I'm not doing this for any other reason than to give you all a chance. We're in this together now, for better or worse. Martha nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Then let's get this done. We don't have time to waste. The preacher, a small, soft-spoken man named Reverend Hale, stood beside them, looking equally nervous. He had never performed a mass wedding before, especially not one as unconventional as this. But he had known Thomas for years, and if Thomas believed in this, then so would he. With a steadying breath, Reverend Hale began the ceremony. He spoke the words slowly, as if he were unsure of the gravity of what he was about to do. But Thomas listened intently, his focus unwavering. The women, each standing next to him, waited patiently, their eyes on the preacher, their minds swirling with a mixture of confusion and acceptance. As the ceremony continued, Thomas couldn't help but think about what this day meant. It wasn't a traditional wedding, and it certainly wasn't something anyone had ever imagined. But it was necessary. These women had been given a lifeline, and he wasn't going to let them down. His promise to them was more than just a piece of paper. It was a new beginning. When the final vows were spoken, Thomas felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. The weight of the decision, the pressure of keeping his promise had been heavy, but now it was done. They were married, all 10 women, each bound to him in a way they never could have anticipated. The ceremony ended in quiet solemnity. There were no cheers, no celebratory gestures. Instead, the women stood there waiting for what would come next. They were now his wives, and while that title didn't hold the same meaning it might have in another time, it still offered them protection. It offered them safety from the auction block, from the lives they had been about to lose. As the women began to leave the chapel, Thomas stayed behind for a moment, looking at the small group of strangers who had just become a part of his life in a way no one could have predicted. He didn't know what the future held for them, but for now they were safe, and that, he thought, was enough. The day after the wedding, Thomas woke up early, as he always did. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows over the fields. But today, everything felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quietness that seemed to hang around the ranch like a storm about to break. His mind was racing with the events of the day before, the 10 women he had married, the strange, hurried ceremony, and the promises he had made. But now reality was setting in. He had saved them from the auction block, but what would happen next? How would they live together on the ranch? What would they think of him? He wasn't sure how to move forward, but he knew he couldn't leave them in uncertainty. His life had already changed, but so had theirs. They were all part of something now, and he needed to guide them through this strange new chapter. As he walked outside, the cold morning air hit his face. He looked out over the ranch, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land seemed endless, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a place of solitude. It felt crowded. The women, though free from the auction, were now his responsibility. He had made a promise, and that promise was one he intended to keep. One by one, the women began to gather in the yard as the morning stretched on. They weren't quite sure how to approach this new life. Some lingered by the barn. Others stood near the house, looking uncertain. They hadn't spoken much since the ceremony, and Thomas understood. They were still adjusting, just as he was. He walked toward Sarah, the first woman he had spoken to. She had agreed to the marriage with a mixture of relief and wariness, and now she stood by the fence looking out at the fields with a quiet expression. "Sarah," Thomas called out as he approached her. She turned, her eyes still holding the sadness from the night before. "How are you feeling today?" She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't know, Mr. Wright. I thought yesterday was a dream, but now, it's real. We're all married to you. What happens now?" Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I know it's not what you expected. It wasn't what any of us expected, but you're safe now. You won't be sold off. You have a place here." Sarah glanced down at the ground, her mind clearly racing. "But we don't know you. We don't know how to live here on your ranch. How will we all fit in?" The question hung in the air. It was the same question Thomas had been asking himself ever since the wedding. He wasn't sure how they would all fit in either. He had the space, but not the knowledge of how to turn his life into something that could work for 10 women. Each of them was different, with different experiences and needs. We'll take it one day at a time, Thomas said. You're welcome here. There's work to be done on the ranch, and I'll show you how to help with that. We'll figure it out together. Sarah nodded slowly, still uncertain but grateful for the assurance. Thank you. I didn't know what would happen to me, but I see now that you're trying to do what's right. Thomas didn't have all the answers, but he was trying. That's all he could offer. As the day wore on, the others began to gather in the yard. They were all still adjusting to their new life, their new roles. Some of the women were quiet, others more outspoken. The oldest, Martha, took it upon herself to organize everyone. We're not going to stand around all day, she said, her voice strong. We have work to do, and this ranch isn't going to run itself. Thomas was surprised by her boldness. It was clear that Martha had lived a life full of hardships and wasn't one to shy away from hard work. She had been the one most resistant to the marriage, but now she seemed determined to contribute. She organized the women into groups, assigning them various tasks around the ranch. Some would help with the horses, others with the gardening, and a few would tend to the house. Thomas watched as they worked, their movements a little stiff at first, but slowly becoming more confident as the day went on. He was grateful for Martha's leadership. It seemed like she was the one who could keep them all focused and on task. But even as the women began to settle into their routines, the tension was still palpable. They were all still strangers to each other, despite the vows they had taken. They had married out of necessity, not love, and the reality of their new lives weighed heavily on them. Later that evening, after a long day of work, Thomas gathered everyone together in the small dining room. The room was simple, just a wooden table and a few chairs, but it felt different now. The women sat quietly, unsure of what to say. Thomas could sense their unease. He knew that this was the moment where he had to offer something more than just protection. He had to offer guidance, a sense of unity, and a way forward. I know this isn't easy for any of you, Thomas began, his voice steady but sincere. We're all in this together now, whether we like it or not. I know we don't know each other well, and I know that things won't be perfect right away. But we have to make this work. We've all been given a second chance, and I won't let that slip away. The women exchanged glances, some of them nodding in agreement, while others remained silent. You don't have to love me, Thomas continued, but we do need to respect each other. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I believe we can build something here. You're safe. You have a home now, and that's more than most people can say. The room was quiet for a moment, and then Martha spoke up. You're right. We've been given a chance. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll work with you, Thomas. I'll do my part. The other women nodded, some more uncertainly than others, but all with a sense of resolve. The first step had been taken. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't what any of them had expected, but they were safe, and they had each other. As the evening wore on, they all settled in for a simple meal, sharing stories of their past lives and the challenges they had faced. It wasn't the grand family they had once dreamed of, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Months passed since the rushed wedding, and life on Thomas Wright's ranch had become something both familiar and strange. The days blurred together in a way that Thomas had never experienced. There was always work to be done, cattle to tend, fields to plow, and the house to maintain. The seasons shifted from one to the next, but the atmosphere on the ranch was changing. The air felt lighter than it had in the beginning. Despite the unusual and awkward start to their new lives, things were beginning to find a rhythm. Thomas had been right when he promised that they would take it one day at a time. It had been hard at first. The women had been strangers to each other, and many of them had come from different backgrounds. But over time, as they worked together, a bond had started to form. They learned to rely on one another, not just for the physical labor on the ranch, but for emotional support as well. At first, there had been a lot of quiet. The women, especially the younger ones like Sarah and Emma, were still grappling with the weight of their new lives. They didn't speak much to Thomas, and when they did, their words were often hesitant. But over time, as they became more comfortable in their new home, the conversations grew. They began to share their hopes, their fears, their pasts, stories of lost family, of hardship, of dreams that never came true. Sarah, who had once been shy and reserved, began to open up more. She had always dreamed of a life beyond the hardships of the small town, but the auction had almost stolen that dream from her. Now she saw that her future wasn't entirely lost, though it was still unclear. The women began to spend more time together, helping each other with everything from tending to the horses to fixing fences and preparing meals. They became a team in a way that none of them had expected. They were no longer just strangers thrown together by circumstance, they were partners. Martha, the oldest of the group, had become a natural leader. Her years of experience in the tough world of the frontier made her invaluable. She kept everyone grounded, reminding them that they could make it through no matter how difficult things got. Her role had shifted from being a reluctant participant in the marriage to someone who took charge when necessary. She would often pull Thomas aside to discuss the ranch's future, asking for his thoughts and offering her own. "Thomas," Martha would say, her voice firm but kind, "we need more than just hard work. We need a plan for the future. The women are learning, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. What will happen if something happens to you? We need to be ready." Thomas, who had spent most of his life focused solely on the land, had to admit that Martha was right. He had never imagined that his life would lead him to be responsible for 10 women. It wasn't just about making sure the cattle were fed or the crops grew. It was about creating a future for everyone involved. Martha's words weighed heavily on him, but he was slowly starting to understand. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about creating something stable, a future they could all count on. As the months turned to a year, Thomas and the women continued to work side by side. The ranch began to thrive in ways Thomas hadn't expected. With the combined efforts of the women and his own persistence, the land had become more productive. The cattle were healthy, the garden was flourishing, and the house had been repaired and expanded. The small community that had once looked at Thomas with skepticism now began to see him in a different light. He wasn't just a man who had taken in a group of women. He was someone who had built something from nothing, someone who had given people a chance when they had no other hope. But the real change was in the women. They had all come to the ranch with the weight of the world on their shoulders, scared and uncertain about their futures. Now they were stronger. They were no longer the women who had been sold at auction. They were capable, confident, and starting to believe in themselves again. Emma, a young woman who had once been shy and afraid, now walked with her head held high. She had taken to the ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. She spent her days helping with the horses, and her nights reading books she had borrowed from the small library in town. Emma had a spark in her that had been dulled by the auction block, but now she was beginning to shine again. The women had found purpose in their work, and though they still had questions about their future, they were no longer waiting for someone to give them answers. They had become a community, bound not just by necessity but by the shared experience of building a new life together. But Thomas knew that he still had a long way to go. The weight of the responsibility that came with his promises hadn't completely lifted. He was still the man who had married 10 women in one day to save them from being sold off, and while he had kept his promise, he wasn't sure if he had done enough. He often found himself lost in thought, wondering what would happen if anything went wrong. But every time he felt doubt creeping in, he reminded himself of the progress they had made. They had come a long way since that first chaotic day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a pink glow over the ranch, Thomas sat on the porch, watching the women laugh and talk as they worked together in the yard. For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but he knew that for now they were safe, and that was enough. Sarah walked over to him, her eyes soft with gratitude. She had grown into someone unrecognizable from the frightened woman who had first stepped onto the ranch. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I don't know how you did it, but you gave us a chance. A real chance. We all have our own reasons for being here, but none of us would have made it without you." Thomas looked at her, his heart full. He had never expected to be anyone's hero, but somehow in the midst of all the chaos, he had become something more than he ever thought possible. "I didn't do it alone," he said simply. "We all did it together." And for the first time since this whole journey began, Thomas felt certain that whatever happened next, they would face it together. They had built something strong, something that no one could take away. They had found a future not in spite of their circumstances, but because of them. And that, he thought, was the greatest gift he could have ever given.